Hi there, I'm Peter Millard, and yes, it is finally here in the 10-Minute Workshop this week. Episode 1 of the Tracksaw Workshop is coming up next. So yeah, if it seems like a long time ago since I first mentioned the Tracksaw Workshop, well, that's because it is a long time ago. Way back at the very end of the very first Festool cheap tool Tracksaw videos, I made an off-the-cuff remark about doing a Tracksaw Workshop series. And it's been a long time since then in the making. I've stopped and started this a couple of times, partly to try and get the scope of what I was trying to do straight in my head, and partly because of work. I had a very, very busy year last year. So something like this really needs to have some time dedicated to it. But we're here now, and in this series we'll be taking a look at tracksaws generally. We'll see why I think a cheap tracksaw is a better bet than a cheap table saw, especially in a small workshop like this one. We'll set up a fresh, out-of-the-box, entry-level tracksaw from scratch. We'll make sure that that all-important first cut to trim back the splinter guard goes without a hitch. We'll even look at making our own long rails for breaking down full sheets and see whether that's a worthwhile investment of your time and effort and money. We'll talk a little bit about blade choice, about dust extraction, routine maintenance, and we'll make some simple jigs that make life easier for the tracksaw user. But before we get into any of that, I'd like to start today with a basic introduction to the tracksaw. So what do we mean when we say tracksaw? Well, for the purposes of this video, I mean something like this. Technically a plunge saw, not just a track saw. Yes, you can get some saws that fit on a track or a guide rail like this that don't plunge. Festool used to make them themselves, but they're pretty few and far between now. I think there's a Bosch and a Makita are the only ones that spring to mind. But most of the time, if you see a track saw or a guide rail saw, it's a plunge saw. I think the term track saw first came about when the Festool patents expired. DeWalt and Makita introduced their own versions of the plunge saw. And I think to try and differentiate theirs a little bit, DeWalt started calling theirs the track saw. Never one to miss a marketing trick. Festool snagged the tracksaw.com domain and pointed that straight towards Festool USA, and it's still there now. If you put tracksaw.com into your browser, it'll take you straight to Festool USA. Either way, the tracksaw is an immensely versatile piece of kit, and it's one of the main reasons why I think it's a better bet than a table saw. How is it different to a regular circular saw? Well, the main difference is that instead of having the blade exposed continuously on a circular saw, admittedly behind a little sprung guide, on a track saw you set the depth of cut on a guide, and then when it comes to make that cut, the blade is exposed, and when you finish the cut, the blade springs back into the housing completely safely. But safety is only one of the benefits of the plunge saw or track saw against a regular circular saw. Because it's running on a guide rail or track, it's extremely accurate. It's as accurate as you are, basically. And because the blade plunges, it's easy to make internal cutout type cuts. So for example, if you're doing a cutout for a kitchen hob or a sink, you can make that cut quickly and easily and accurately with a plunge saw and a guide rail. And because the guide rail has a splinter guard, a rubber strip that bears firmly against the top surface, you can make clean, splinter-free cuts in difficult substrates, again, quickly and easily. Now, one of the big benefits of using a track saw rather than a table saw in a small workspace like this one is quite simply space. If I was using my table saw like this, even to cut a relatively small piece like this, this is only about a third of a sheet, of a full sheet. I'd need a lot more space either side. I need a lot more space around the saw, and a lot of space behind it, even to make that relatively short 700 or 800mm cut. Whereas making that same cut with a track saw, because you're bringing the saw to the workpiece, is much, much easier and much more efficient in a small space. To use a table saw in a small workshop like this one, then it would have to be on a mobile base of some kind. You need to bring it into the middle of the workshop just to be able to move the boards through it. Now there's a couple of areas where a table saw is perhaps better than a track saw. One of those is repetitive narrow rips. There's a couple of simple jigs that we can make that will help the track saw in that situation. But if it's something you do a lot of, then a table saw is very useful for that. There's no denying that. That's the reason I have one, and that's pretty much all it gets used for. The other area is if you're making a bevel cut and you want the bevel to be on the top face of a board. That's hard to do with the track saw just because of the way that the bevel works. It always tips so that the bevel comes on the undercut, on the bottom face of the board. And if you particularly need it in the top face of a board, then a table saw's kind of the way to go on that, or use a router, of course, is another option. But for most people making most ordinary projects, I think a track saw is going to be a better bet in a small workspace than a table saw. But instead of listening to me yammer on about it, why don't I show you just how versatile they can be? Now, the Christmas before last, I did a little gift idea series of little projects for you to make to give as gifts. One of those was a set of birch ply trays, just simple little things. They were just half lapped together, and the half laps were done by trenching cuts on the Makita saw. They were then cleaned up on the router bench. It was grooved all around the sides, again on the router bench with the grooving bit, and then there was a 6mm birch ply base fitted in and the whole thing glued together. I'm going to make one of those for you now, but I'm only going to use the track saw to do every single operation. Now, I will use my Festool track saw for this because I'm more familiar with it, but I'm not going to use any of the other fancy gear. I'm not going to use the MFT or any of the other fancy bits and pieces. It'll just be the saw and the rail, and we'll make these trays. I've raided my scraps pile and found a few bits and pieces, and I'm just trimming them to length. Notice how I'm using an offcut to balance the rail at either end. And then I can cut 80mm strips for the tray sides, just using the grippy strip from the rail to keep everything in place. I've set the depth of cut to 6mm, and after a quick test I can make the half lap rebates, butting the two longer sides together and using a piece of scrap to gauge the width, making repeat cuts with the saw until the whole rebate is made on both ends. The tray sides need to be grooved for the base, and I'm using another piece of scrap as a guide, then with the saw still set to the same depth, making repeat cuts on each side until the groove is the right thickness for the base. And with the sides completed, we can cut the 6mm base to size, and after a quick dry fit, start on the glue up. I'm using my usual Poly 10 PVA and just clamping it up with tape. So there we are, a little birch ply tray made entirely with a track saw. Now, at the risk of sounding like I'm getting my excuses in early, I made it pretty quickly, and it was a little bit gappy, and it probably could have done with some better clamping than a few bits of tape. But for a quick and dirty little project, knocked together in 20 minutes, it's not bad actually. Needs a rub down and a coat of lacquer, obviously, and as I say, a little bit gappy. Could have done with some proper clamping other than some bits of tape. But really, I hope that demonstrates just what a track saw can do. Now, I know there's a couple of hundred people typing furiously that they can do exactly that self-same thing on a table saw. And yes, you can kind of, but you need to take off the blade guard, and you probably need to take off the riving knife, or at least cut it down or reduce the height of it somehow. Both of which are real no-nos in a commercial workshop. What you do in the privacy of your own workshop, much like the privacy of your own home, is entirely your business. But in a commercial workshop, you're liable to quite a serious fine if you do get caught using an unguarded blade like this. I am attached to my fingers, and my fingers are attached to me. So I'm going to do what I do. You feel free to do what you do. But for me, a track saw is absolutely a better starting point than a cheap table saw, especially in a small workshop. depending on the projects that you intend to take on, of course. But that's it for this first episode of the Tracksaw Workshop. Join me in part 2 when we'll pull apart a brand new, fresh out of the box Tracksaw and start setting it up to make that tricky first cut. I'll see you next time.